So your first talking point is we could be heading for a Great Depression. Talk about that and the significance of what Bitcoin's going to play in that.
Yeah, man, I'm curious what you think about that before I start going. Do you think we're at the precipice of some sort of big systemic crisis here? Or do you think they're just going to print their way out of it and
I
we're gonna
think
be
that
able
they're
to
going to
keep
try to
going?
print their way out of it. I don't think the government's ever going to get out of debt, like never, ever, ever, ever. It's not happening at the levels that they're going at. Let me just grab the M1 money supply chart because that's probably relevant. I'm sure you already know what this is, but for the viewers that don't, this is worth just throwing up on the screen too. So if you're not familiar, this is 2019 ending here. And then this is all the money that was printed in 2020.
So do you know what happened right there when that parabolic rise started?
Yeah, talk about that.
So in 2019, I mean, we're seeing the stock market just continue to go up and up and up over Trump's presidency, and with lowering tax rates and printing money and stimulus and all that stuff. But really, presidents don't have much of an impact on the stock market. It's really the central bankers and the Federal Reserve and the manipulation of the interest rates that controls the stock market. Mm-hmm. So when 2019, September 2019, there was this thing that happened, which was like a real big crack showed up in the financial markets to show that everything that they did over the last 10 years to try to paper over the 2008 subprime mortgage collapse didn't work. So in 2008, the regulators globally came together and created these Basel Accords, which are kind of like a set of regulations that are like stress tests for the central banks and the systemically important banks, like the big, huge banks. And these things are like, you got to have a certain amount of reserves backing the money in your accounts for your customers. So much risk with your commercial banking. You got to meet a certain amount of expected 30-day withdrawals for normal activities, so that the banks basically can't be too over levered like they were in 2008, which ended up causing the whole thing to melt down, right? Mm. The banks, if everybody hasn't watched The Big Short, obviously it's a great sort of dramatic take on what happened. It's pretty much truly what happened.
Yeah, that's on Netflix too still, I think.
Yeah, it is. And they basically discovered that there's this kind of fraud happening on Wall Street where the ratings agencies like Standard & Poor's were just taking fees from the big banks to make these extremely toxic, risky derivatives products that they would then go and sell to other banks and to pension funds and to other investors. And they would mix toxic assets with good assets. So they take like AAA rated stuff like government bonds, right? You'd think the US debt is a AAA rated asset. It's not going to bankrupt, but they would stack that in with toxic shit like subprime mortgages and derivative bets, synthetic bets on subprime mortgages. So it creates this toxic basket that everybody thinks is good. And then they sell it to each other. And then banks have this thing called the repo market. It's an overnight lending window where banks can borrow money from each other, and not just borrow money, but these derivative instruments. So I'm trying not to get too deep into it to confuse people, but just say that these banks are gambling with each other and they're lending each other base money. So this M2 money or M1 money supply here, there's layers of money in the system. There's M0, which is base layer money. You think that that's the seed of money. It's real dollars. It's stuff that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury creates. And then banks can fractionally lend it out to each other and to people and then take loans on it and fractional reserve that up into the M1 money supply. So that like $100 of base money, $1,000 of M1 and M2 money. And go ahead.
So sorry, I was just going to jump in here and just kind of like distill it down a little bit because I want to keep it at the basics level. So when I look at this chart, I'm looking at the billions of dollars that have been printed. And this is, where the cursor is right now, it's January 2020. So let's say the start of 2020. So it's January 6th here. As I drag the cursor across here, you can see all the years we're at 2010, 2005, 2000, all the way down to 1980. They have printed a ton of money, about a third, it looks like, because I went from 4,000 to 7,000 billions of dollars is what it says here.
Yeah,
This is
it's
insane.
trillions. It's trillions of dollars that they've printed.
Yeah, like this is insane. Like you cannot fathom what kind of effect this is going to have on the marketplace, the stock. Like it doesn't look like it's had much of, like much of a
Yeah.
effect from the user's end. Like, you still go to the gas station and gas pretty much costs the same. You want to buy a loaf of bread, it's pretty much the same. Everything's kind of like, you don't really notice it. But the thing that most people don't understand is that the value, like the purchasing value of your dollar keeps going down over time because they keep making more money. They keep printing it out of thin air, which is one of the problems that Bitcoin solves, because there's a limited supply. There's only ever going to be 21 million of these things. I heard somewhere that, because one of the things that I've heard people protest is, well, what happens when they run out of mining Bitcoin? And I think somewhere I came across the stat where they're saying that because of each halving event every 4 odd years or so, they're legitimately going to be mining this stuff until like 2150 or something like that.
Yeah, there's not really a risk that Bitcoin's going to run out of like security. The miners are pretty well paid security guards for the Bitcoin network, and it's the biggest, like most secure network on the planet. Has more computing power than the NSA and the CIA and the government of China and the America and Google and Facebook all put together. There's
Okay.
there's more decentralized computing power securing Bitcoin than anything else on the planet. So that's a really well paid system of compute power. And there's also transaction fees inside of every Bitcoin transaction. So there's kind of like a mathematical formula that shows that the fees are going to replace the block reward probably in around 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not really going to have to worry about it, because the miners are still going to want to process Bitcoin transactions, because they're not going to be paid Bitcoin from the block reward anymore, but they're going to be paid Bitcoin in every block with fees from people like you and me who are using Bitcoin and paying fees to the miners.
Right.
So Satoshi created this this system of game theory incentives with putting 50 Bitcoins bounties in every block when it was launched, because there was no fees. No one was using it, so there was no fees there. So he had to reward people somehow. So he created the way to issue the whole supply over 100 years via block rewards. And then we got to the point now where it's like the fourth epoch of Bitcoin, where the halving is not for another 3 years. And there's 6.25 Bitcoin now being issued in every block. That's enough to like incentivize it to be the biggest computing network on the planet. And as the price of Bitcoin goes up, and as millions and millions of more people come onto the Bitcoin network, the fees will eventually replace the block reward. And as Bitcoin price goes up, so do the fees. So that's why Bitcoin, like, that's why I'd say that in the next 20 years or so, most of the block reward Bitcoins are going to be already issued. And then at that point, it'll be fees securing the network more so than the block reward for the next 100 years or whatever.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to that point of we could be heading for the Great Depression. So
that
your
chart,
question to me
man,
is,
like,
what do you think is going to happen? In my view, is the government's never going to get out of debt. They're going to keep printing money. I feel like that the Great Depression should have happened already. You feel like it's long overdue, but it never seems to come, right?
Yeah.
So what's your position on that?
Well, like, we're seeing it show up in that chart that you just showed. Like, they don't really have many tools left. In 2008, they had the tool of printing money, and that's what they did. They printed $4 or $5 trillion and did the quantitative easing, the bailouts of Wall Street and all the big corporations that were taking too much risk and got bailed out by the taxpayer. And then they kept this overnight lending window open, but they weren't using it. So they were trying to say, we're not doing quantitative easing anymore. The markets are healthy. Look, the Basel III requirements are getting put in. The banks have stress tests. They're passing them. So then in September 2019, right before that tick in the chart, the banks stopped lending to each other, and the interest rate shot up to 8 to 10%. And while the prime rates, like the central bank rate, was like 0.5%. And they tried to raise the interest rate a little bit, because the only thing to stop printing money, what they have to do is they have to raise the interest rates, because then they can, like, when the rates go higher, people will borrow less. Like, the banks will borrow less and they'll do less risky derivative stuff because it's actually more expensive to take bets. But when the rates are low, it encourages a lot of like risky stuff to happen in the markets. And 2010, 2008 gave all the bankers basically the permission to take as much risk as they wanted, because they knew that when they blew up the system, they'd get bailed out. And so what did they do in 2019 when the rates went up a smidge, like 0.25%? They tried to raise them a little tiny bit. The banks just started to blow up. They started to stop lending, thing that caused the whole credit crunch in 2008. So they quickly said, like, we're going to give you as much money as you want. Okay, the overnight window is open. Anybody can take money. And they started printing hundreds of billions of dollars of base money, like the M0 money, that can then be fractionally reserved into trillions of dollars through lending and through the money multiplier. So it took a few months to see it, but then it's not just the Federal Reserve printing money that caused that parabolic rise. That's part of it, but it's also the Federal Reserve is more like sinister, like in the way that they're just printing money directly into the bank accounts through the overnight repo markets, and it's continuing ongoing quantitative easing. Now, what this does is like, it doesn't let banks fail. It doesn't let companies fail. It just lets them continue to do the same risky, toxic behavior that caused the 2008 collapse and caused the March crisis. When we saw everything drop like crazy in March, it's because they didn't actually get to the point where they could pass the stress tests. So they had 10 years to get up like the proper liquidity reserves and proper risk management protocols and everything. And then when the day came that they had to actually put them in place, the whole thing fell apart, and they had to print $6 trillion to bail everybody out. And they've suspended all requirements for any systemically important bank to have to meet any of the stress tests. So they don't need to even have any percent reserves anymore. So literally the money in your bank, how long can it go on?
Yeah. Before the whole thing collapses on itself.
Well, that's the thing that's why, like, we could be heading for Great Depression 2.0, because this does not make any sense that that money itself can just be printed and inflated 25% like this on a parabolic like scale, and that it wouldn't cause some kind of hyperinflation. Like, this is what happened in Weimar Germany. Like, they got ahead of themselves with the money printing. Think we're headed for that type of level of hyperinflation like you see in Argentina or Venezuela or Lebanon or something like that happened over the last few years, because we got to, like, there's a few tools they have left. There's countries in the world where the interest rates have actually gone negative, and they've been toying with that in Europe and Japan for a while. So we could see negative interest rates before we see hyperinflation, because they do have a few tools left in the tool belt to, like, what we're seeing actually today with all the stock shenanigans going on with GameStop. Those are some more tools that they have. They can actually, like, before we see Great Depression or like hyperinflation, here's some things they can do. They can print another $10 trillion, right? Like, that's not going to cause hyperinflation. It's just going to continue to allow them to kick the can down the road for another few years. They can print $10 more trillion. They can lower interest rates into the negative territory. They can write off half your student loan debt. They can give everybody 0% mortgages to stimulate people to go buy and lower the down payment requirements for a year, say. They can do some sort of stimulus like they've been doing, like direct payments into people's bank accounts. And like, they could double everybody's credit cards. Like, if you got a $10,000 limit on your credit card, they could say, this is like a debt jubilee sort of thing where everybody now has an extra
government go in and just take money from people, like, just to, deny them access to their bank accounts and liquidate balances, right? Like, we've seen, was it Cyprus or Greece that did that?
Yeah, Cyprus and Greece did that. Greece did the sovereign default on their debt, and all the wealthy people that had like a lot of money in banks just woke up to half their money was just gone. So like, that's a darker path we can go down, is like, okay, the one thing they can do to stop a global depression is to switch to modern monetary theory and like do a lot of debt forgiveness and stimulation. But they're kind of already like to the point where the biggest metric you want to look for that is the debt to GDP ratio. And like, we're at like 130% debt to GDP to debt. Sorry, debt to GDP. And that's the highest it's ever been in history. Like, before, the big difference between now and before and other times during the Depression and World War II and things like that is that they didn't use up any of these tools yet. Like, they didn't do massive stimulus. They didn't do interest rates low. Like, back then, the interest rates were so high that they could actually taper the interest rates down to like 3% or something, and that would help the economy. But now they've used nearly everything in the tool belt, and they've jacked up the they've jacked up the debt rate so high that it's 130% or something debt to GDP, where that's bigger than it was during World War II. So there's not even a really systemic global emergency happening. Like, could you imagine if there was like a world war breakout or something right now? They don't have the ability to lower the interest rates much more at all. They don't have the ability to print more money, because then that would put us to a 200% debt to GDP. And that's just like, it's already uncharted territory. We're at the precipice right now of some huge systemic shift. And it's going to either be a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah. So I'm hoping it's the good thing. I'm hoping it's not Great Depression, but man, it's
well, okay, so let's move on. So I mean, like, what he's basically saying there is, if you take all the ingredients of what's going on in the economic world today and you put it in a blender and turn that thing on, you're basically going to pour yourself a nice shit shake. Okay, like, that's
yeah,
that's exactly what we're dealing with here, a shit shake.